Phil Wickham, whose real name is Philip David Wickham, came into this world on April 5th, 1984, in San Diego, California. Love, faith, and music were constants in his childhood home. His life was extraordinary because he was engrossed in worship music from a young age. His parents, John and Lisa Wickham, were both heavily involved in music ministry. Their devotion to worship greatly influenced their offspring. In Phil's family, singing was always an integral part of worship, just as it was for his older brother Evan and younger sister Jillian. This laid the groundwork for Phil to go on as a Christian musician and worship leader. From the moment he learned to walk and speak, Phil was surrounded by melodies and rhythms. The father, John Wickham, was a member of the Christian rock group The Road Home. In every aspect of life, music played an important role. No matter what time of day it was, his parents' voices or guitars could be heard singing praises to God in their home. On occasion, the entire household would gather for a time of worship. Phil rapidly developed a love for prayer, and attending church on Sundays was more than just a routine. It was an integral aspect of their lives. From the time he was a little boy, Phil has cherished singing. He was encouraged to pursue his talent by his parents, who noticed it in him at a young age. Every time his dad played guitar, he was astounded. He quickly became eager to figure it out on his own. At the age of 12, he received his first guitar and proceeded to educate himself on the instrument. The instrument that would later become his trademark required him to put in a lot of time practicing. He accomplished this by emulating the hymns he heard in church and at home. After moving there with his family, Phil spent the majority of his youth in Vista, California. As a child, he was full of life and energy, yet he also had a reflective side. He enjoyed time alone to write in his journals or compose music in his imagination. The ability to create something lovely out of his emotions brought him solace, and he eventually mastered the art of musical expression. When Phil was a kid, he already had a strong faith in God. He was experiencing the joy of the songs as much as singing them. He found that music was a way to communicate with God, and he aspired to compose songs that could inspire others to find solace in music. After he began leading worship for his youth group, he felt confident in his ability to bring others to a state of adoration. Songs that were genuine, written from the heart, and glorifying to God were his deepest desires. One of Phil's older brothers, Evan Wickham, was a gifted musician in his own right. The brothers supported and encouraged one another while playing music together. As worshipers and siblings, their bond would be strengthened through joint songwriting, singing, and leading prayer. Thanks to their healthy rivalry, Phil was driven to excel in his work. Delirious, Chris Tomlin, and David Crowder were among the many Christian singers that Phil began to appreciate as he matured. He aspired to one day use music in the same way they did to bring people to worship. Because he liked it, he poured his soul into the lyrics of his original songs, which revealed his deep devotion to God. Phil self-produced his debut album at the age of 18. People from outside his church took notice of his little project. Word of his talent spread rapidly, and he started to get fans. His voice was so distinctive and otherworldly that it set him apart from other prayer leaders. Soon he was being asked to lead prayer at various churches and events due to the widespread admiration for his ability to blend profound biblical themes with contemporary, infectious music. When he signed with Simple Records and released Phil Wickham in 2006, it was his big break. Songs like Divine Romance demonstrated his talent for composing captivating lyrics that evoked reverence. His devotion to God and concern for others shone through in every note. His music was quickly getting out of Vista and into the world. When asked about his formative years, Phil frequently attributes his current role as a worship leader to his family and religious upbringing. Along his path, he relied heavily on his parents' devout religion, his family's unwavering support, and the profound appreciation for music that permeated his childhood. His childhood teaching that praise is more than simply singing songs, it's also about living a life that brings glory to God. remained with him even as his career took off and he became a household name in Christian music. Faith, perseverance, and answering God's call propelled him from humble beginnings as a child musician in his family's living room to global fame as a worship leader. In every note he writes and note he plays, Phil's heart remains the same as the worshipful child he once was. Awe, gratitude, and an unfaltering love for God fill his heart. Strategies for handling criticism. Being a Christian musician and praise leader was never going to be easy, according to Phil Wickham. He had dedicated his life to music for a long time, penning hymns that he hoped would draw listeners closer to God. He was unprepared for the weight of public criticism despite his strong faith. Criticism of that nature cuts deeply and takes time to mend. At first, it was very silent, like the wind whispering. Initially, Phil paid little heed to the online reviews and opinions. In his mind, it was more important to follow his calling than to care what other people thought. Over time, the sounds and words became increasingly audible and distinct. Too much polish is on his music. His worship sounds more like a show than a generous offering from the heart. Phil Wickham has changed for the worse. Wound by the words. He had always taken pride in penning songs from a genuine worship space, but now his audience was accusing him of playing the role of an entertainer rather than a worship leader. The release of one of his most private records brought out the worst in the criticism. He poured his heart out to God in every word and spent months crafting the album, making sure every song reflected his relationship with God. But rather than receiving universal praise, he was inundated with critical comments. His music had gotten too commercialized, according to some of his fans, who thought he had sold out. Some thought his sound was too generic and that he had lost the intensity that had made him unique among worship acts. Some in the Christian music industry even questioned whether or not his songs were genuinely inspiring worship or if they were more of a distraction. Tossing it aside was Phil's intent, since he wasn't doing this for the approval of others, but rather to bring glory to God. He rationalized his actions. However, the words deeply wounded him. His decisions began to trouble him. Did it fail to function? Had he forgotten the things that were important? After a particularly trying performance, during which he felt emotionally distant and alone, he sat in his dressing room and stared at his reflection in the mirror. He was exhausted, hit hard. Worship, he had always believed, required sacrifice, but he was at a loss as to what he could sacrifice. It was Marie, his wife, who saw the change in him. She noticed that the once joyous man who would wake up humming new tunes was now withdrawn and filled with uncertainty. As he sat at the piano one evening, his hands lightly resting on the keys, he did not play a note. She delicately placed a hand on his shoulder. "Phil, you're not defined by what people say," she whispered. "Your prayer is just for you and God. It is never in vain if your music is an offering to Him." What she said caused him to cry. He became so enraged by the criticism that he lost sight of the original motivation. Worship did not require flawlessness. It had nothing to do with gaining favor. Regardless of what other people thought, it was about trusting God and giving up. Later that night, he began to play the piano, not for an audience or a recording, but for God alone. A completely unaltered version of his new song was released by him. It wasn't flawless, but it was genuine. Slowly but surely, Phil became accustomed to the noises and eventually learned to ignore them. The complaints persisted, but they had no effect on him either. Nothing else would ever matter to him as long as his music continued to be an authentic expression of his devotion to God. Even in the face of suffering, uncertainty, and rediscovery, his faith grew stronger. Finally, it brought home to him what he had always known. Worship isn't about showing off. All eyes were on the heart. Nothing, not even the most critical remarks, could ever change that.